All right, I have a serious confession to make because I got this wrong for quite a while, and I realize now in hindsight I could have been getting a lot more done. So most of us are comparing Claude Cowork with Claude Code, and we're asking the wrong question. And understanding the tools is basically the vital thing here. So what interface, for example, is easier? Which one is more powerful? Do I have to know how to code? But the question is not that actually. What really matters ultimately is, do you need AI to finish one task, or do you want to build a system that finishes entire categories of work basically better and better every single week? And these two things ultimately sound similar in a business, but they're actually worlds apart. And this is all where we're all going wrong, because actually within AI, a lot of the naming of the tools are bizarrely kind of off the mark, shall we say. So, one gives you assistance, but the other one will give you compounding leverage week on week. And right now, a lot of kind of intelligent professionals and executives are choosing based on the least important thing, which ultimately is kind of which screen feels more comfortable on day one when you're quickly trying to get the thing done. So in this video, I'm going to give you a simple way to decide basically whether, Claude Cowork or Claude Code is the way to go. I'll show you where Cowork basically genuinely excels and why Code can become far more valuable than a chat window, what the switch really is kind of between the costs, and then a couple of days test that you can really commit to decide whether one or the other is right, because the winner is not the one that impresses you in the first kind of 10 minutes. It's the tool that ultimately makes the 10th repetition cheaper, faster, and better than the first. So first, let's correct something that has already become outdated, okay? Cowork is not simply a basic file assistant with training wheels. It can now run work in cloud, it can continue on the background, it can handle files, research, documents, spreadsheets, presentations, all sorts of browser-based tasks essentially. It has projects, it can have instructions, scheduled work, and even kind of project level memory, which is the big one. The memory aspect is huge with this to grow over time. So it does all of that essentially through an interface that feels much more closer to a kind of a normal AI chat than, a developer environment. And that is a serious product. But for many people, it might not be the right product. So imagine, for example, hypothetically, you have a board meeting on Friday, okay? You gave Cowork last month's report, this month's figures, the meeting notes, and the presentation template. You ask it, for example, to identify the biggest challenges, the changes, change the drafts, basically, change the narrative, and produce the first version of the deck. This is a super well kind of framed assignment. It has clear inputs, it has a clear output, and a very direct, clear finish line. Or, for example, perhaps you needed to clean up a folder, compare several kind of supplier proposals, turn interviews into a research summary, or prepare a client briefing from a collection of documents. So Cowork is very good at this kind of delegated outcome with a clear framework. You hand it a job, it goes away, it does the work, and ultimately brings something back. So for an owner or for an executive or a consultant who wants to be useful, without thinking about the machinery underneath, this is super attractive. But finishing work is not the same as building a system. So this is where Claude Code becomes super interesting, even if you never intend to write a line of software. And this is what I mentioned around the naming concept of like Codex in ChatGPT and Code in Claude. The word code makes many technical think, like non-technical folks like myself, think this is not for me. And that can be a super, super expensive assumption basically, because Claude Code is not valuable only because it can create software. It's valuable ultimately because it can work inside an environment where your files, your instructions, your rules, your tools, and your history become part of a visible operating system. And so instead of attaching the same brand guidelines every time, your brand basically can live within a working folder. So equally, instead of explaining kind of how you qualify a sales lead, that decision process can live in a clear instruction file. So instead of creating some sort of problem for the 15th time, you can basically just turn that into a permanent rule. And that's the way to think about Claude Code. It's a way to set up rule-based recurring tasks for yourself. So instead of trusting that the AI has somehow kind of learned your business, you can actually inspect exactly what it's been told and improve it version upon version. So the last point matters more than most of us really realize, because business knowledge shouldn't exist only as a vague memory inside a model, because we probably have noticed at this stage, I know the memory is on for most of us, let's say, within the tools that we're using, but when you try to recall it, it is super vague and it tends to kind of hallucinate a little bit, but it should actually exist as clinically clear rules. and the standard operating procedure basically with your definitions, your quality thresholds, your approved samples, your escalation rules, your even compliance boundaries, your preferences, and basically everything that you've recorded when it needed to be fixed. And when those things live in essentially ordinary files and rules, they become reviewable. It's not this vague hallucinating memory. They actually become also portable. So bringing them to another AI tool is super important. Another team member can understand them and a manager can ultimately approve them. So, like I said, if you change models later and the knowledge doesn't have a way to be extracted, then all that work just disappears basically. And that's the real difference here. Cowork is designed to make delegation easier, whereas Claude can make the operating layer more explicit and continuous. So no, Claude Code doesn't just magically create that system for you. Unfortunately, you have to decide what good work looks like yourself. So you have to maintain the information and the standard, and you still have to correct weak processes. But ultimately, Claude Code gives you more control over the machinery and allows those improvements to accumulate and compound. That's what I mentioned at the start. So here's a simple example, all right? Suppose your company produces like a weekly management report. With Cowork, you can essentially supply the relevant files each time and ask for the report. That could save you hours, and for many businesses, that is already in itself a win. With Claude Code, you can actually go further, believe it or not. Okay, you can maintain one folder containing the current KPI definitions, the reporting template, the approved tone, the source files, the variance thresholds, the questions management to always ask, and a log of corrections from previous reports. The first report may take more setup. Of course, it's a bit tedious, but when management says basically, for example, never describe a revenue increase as growth if it came entirely from a one-off contract, that correction can become part of the system. That's part of your DNA of the system, okay? Or for example, when finance changes the definition of active customers, you update it once ultimately in the source of truth, which that source of truth can then compound over time. Where a number falls outside kind of an agreed range, the system can be told to flag it for human review instead of confidently inventing an explanation. Because we have to remember, sometimes AI can be scarily confident. So the goal here is to create a reporting process that becomes more reliable every time it runs. So the same principle essentially applies to content. Cowork can create an article from a research pack, versus Claude Code can work inside a content system containing your voice guide, your product positioning, your approved claims, your banned phrasing, for example, your sourcing standards, and strong examples of what you see as kind of the gold star, the North Star of where you want to achieve, and then it can apply that. So there's tons of different ways that this can be super helpful, and really it's just a case of understanding the difference between the two tools, and most of us don't. So the memory can be useful for sure, but an inspectable source of truth is ultimately more dependable. So if the exact rule affects, for example, revenue or reputation or legal exposure or a client relationship, you should be able to find it, read it, and verify that it's current. And so, should everyone kind of abandon Cowork and move to Claude Code? No, definitely not. What I'm saying here is most people should stop treating this as a winner takes all kind of contest. So what you want to think of it is use Cowork when the work is occasional, essentially self-contained and outcome based. Use it when you want to hand over a collection of materials and receive a document analysis or a presentation or organized set of files, but a once-off thing essentially. Use it when the convenience matters more than building the infrastructure around the task. And use it when the process is still changing so quickly that it might be premature to build that system. So that's the way to think of it. But Claude Code is when the work repeats, all right? When you keep making the same corrections, when you have several files and rules and tools that kind of must work together, and when a team needs one standard rather than 5 different slightly versions of the truth, that is when you want to basically use code, when you want to be able to inspect the DNA of the guidance that you're giving the tool basically, and use it when the value will come not from one impressive output, but from hundreds of increasingly consistent outputs over time. So my shorthand, for example, is this, all right? Cowork is the delegation layer and Claude Code is the operating layer. So probably nearly all of us need both, but before you rush into Claude Code, you need to understand, the cost involved, because the extra power also is not free. The first cost is obviously the setup. You have to put serious kind of effort into building the workflow that might take longer than just giving Cowork a quick task. You've got to organize the source material, define the rules. Don't get me wrong, it's an absolute pain in the neck. I hate it, you hate it, all of that sort of stuff, but think of the time you're saving in the future. The second cost is the maintenance. You have to kind of update the source of truth as changes come to those kind of rules. So there's a price for your time, things change, staff change, but if you can keep this thing updated and continually growing, you're going to build a crazy compounding tool within your business. So the AI will not always know which instruction has gone stale, but someone must own the system. And I guess the third cost is the risk. You have to understand that you're potentially putting risk by building out this kind of crazily intelligent machine that knows your business, all right? So this is why, neither is right or wrong, but understanding basically the difference between the two tools is so vital. And this is how you want to basically not judge them only by the result of what looks prettier, but score them basically on a couple of things, which is the output quality, the setup time, the traceability, the repeatability, and the ease of correction, and ultimately the risk factor. So this is the interesting opportunity that you have. There's a huge kind of chance for someone to put these repeatable processes in a way that they can be inspected, improved, and transferred, and Claude Code may just be worth the additional setup. So if you're running a business or you're looking to pitch this as a service, this is a system that can be super easily designed to perform. And again, in summary, Cowork is where you delegate work, and Code is where you design how the work ultimately gets done. The question is not which Claude version is best. The question is ultimately which parts of your work should remain tasks and which parts deserve to become assets. So if you found that helpful, I would love to hear from you. I'm fascinated by this stuff and fascinated by the way that executives can get themselves up the ladder in companies by taking control of these opportunities that you're going to look back on with regret in the years to come, because there's going to be people with titles who are going to have these roles, or alternatively, you can gobble up this opportunity, increase your salary, and make yourself irreplaceable.